So, before we get started, just FYI, I have not graded your papers yet. I'm working on them, I promise. I've just got so many other classes, but you should have your paper grades by the end of the week. Hopefully. Okay. Yeah, I've learned not to promise absolutes. Like politicians, teachers should never promise absolutes.
We kind of have the same thing with it. We don't make promises. We just say maybe.
Maybe, yeah.
That's all we say. Maybe years or maybe years we don't make promises.
Smart. So we talked last time about some of the sources of funding, taxes, user fees, and so on. Today we're going to talk about how we spend the money, the type of budget we create, and where the money is actually going. All right, so we don't like paying taxes, obviously. People don't like losing money. But we need to pay taxes. Why? Well, it's how we fund what we want. A tax on gasoline helps to keep the roads in decent working order, not great, but decent. And it's paid by people who have a car. If you don't have a car, you're not paying the gas tax. So 2/3 of the revenue goes to road repair, maintenance, and building. The other third goes to the schools. So when you buy gasoline, you are actually helping the state economy. So, yay. And we do see some benefit from providing money today. The money that goes to schools comes back around when those students enter the economy. So it's not an automatic return on the investment. It's a long-term strategy. The better educated the people of Texas, the better workforce you have available. So school taxes are seen as a future investment into the economy. So people don't necessarily have a problem with that. Because who knows, maybe at a Texas high school we get the next Amazon, right? We get someone who creates the next Amazon. Who knows? And of course, we do charge quite a bit of a tax on cigarettes. And people don't necessarily have a problem with that. If you can convince people to stop smoking because it's too expensive, it's not necessarily a bad thing. The problem, however, is that while some of the taxes do go on tobacco, do go to schools and parks, the money's not going into cancer research or anti-smoking information. So if you want people to stop smoking, shouldn't part of the taxes maybe go into helping to create non-smoking programs, helping people to get medications to stop smoking? That would make more sense, I would think. And the other argument we tend to see is what's called a pay-benefit basis. Where basically you pay to get basic goods and services, but this could be extremely unequal. Parents would not be able to afford to educate their children if they had to pay everything for schools. We'd have a very well-educated group of wealthy children and a very poorly educated group of lower-income Texans. So it makes sense that we have taxes because if every parent had to pay for everything in their school district, the majority of students probably would never go to school. Right, so what are some of the problems with our tax system? Well, it's not very adequate, and it's not very fair. When you look at it, poor citizens tend to feel the pinch of the sales and gas tax a lot more than the wealthier Texans. And because we don't charge corporations enough in taxes, our system isn't quite funded enough to make sure everything gets funded. So it's not very adequate, and it's definitely not fair. What it is, though, it is pretty well managed. The state has been pretty good about working with what they have, rather than trying to push for what they don't. And so to relieve some of the tax burden, we have seen the use of private prisons. States tend to like them because then the cost is on the private company and not the state of Texas, right? Yeah. Saves them a lot of money if a company comes in and fills the prison instead. On the other hand, state prisons do provide a fair amount of jobs for workers, so pick one or the other, right? Yeah. And of course, the tuition that you pay as college students, that's a private tax, right? Not everybody pays college tuition, but you do. So there are some taxes that are essentially private. College tuition is one of them. If you are going to Texas A&M, you would also have the cost of housing, meals, and so on. So the loans that students take out for the tuition they pay up front is a private tax. So, yay, you guys are actually helping to keep this college open. The reality is here in Texas that we desperately need a state income tax. But that's not likely to happen. People don't like paying more tax than they have to. In states like Massachusetts, when I lived there, I would get charged federal income tax and state income tax. Federal Social Security and Medicare, state Social Security and Medicare. So you're paying two sets of taxes, and you have to file two separate tax returns, one federal, one state, which is quite frankly kind of a pain in the neck, but most states do have a state income tax. We do not, mostly because the government doesn't like the idea of taxing people more. And at the end of last year, we have now made it harder for a state income tax to exist because an amendment was passed that said for the state legislature to create a state income tax, they now need a 2/3 majority in both chambers rather than a simple majority. So now it's become harder for a state income tax to be created. It's not impossible, it's just a lot harder. And I think the only way we would see a state income tax is if the oil industry completely bottomed out and they had no other choice but to create some kind of new tax system. But our system is regressive. I mean, if you are relying on sales tax and others, then you're placing a higher burden on the poor and not the wealthy. An 8.25% sales tax isn't going to hurt someone making $100,000 a year, but it's really going to hurt someone who only gets $10,000 a year. So, unfortunately, our tax system tends to benefit the wealthy, but that's actually a national problem, not just in Texas. All right, budgets. Yeah, always a fun topic. Okay, so how much money is given depends on, of course, a couple of different things. How many interest groups are involved? Who's in favor of it? Who's not? Business interests are in favor, environmentalists opposed. business interests are going to tend to win out. It's also going to depend on the ability to compromise. Maybe you say, we'll take 50,000 less in our budget in exchange for the ability to hire another manager. Or we'll help fund your project if you help fund mine. And coalitions. The more people you have supporting your project, the better the chances are that you're going to get what you want. So the more bipartisanship you have, the more willing you are to compromise, and the more interest groups you have on your side, you got a really good shot of getting what you want. And then, of course, you've got the views of the legislators, the governor, and the state bureaucracy. Our current governor tends to favor a smaller budget, less money going into state agencies. If somehow in 2022 a Democrat managed to defeat Abbott, that might actually change. The state legislature is still controlled by the Republicans, but again, that's a changing factor. So who knows? 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, that may change. And this isn't a decision that they can make lightly. If you cut spending in one area, it is going to hurt a certain group of people. If you slash welfare spending, then the poverty rate is likely to go up. You slash money for schools, and we see less quality in education. So the decisions they make on where our taxes go and how much gets spent does impact hundreds of different political actors, state agencies, interest groups, and us. We do feel the pinch when the state legislature decides to reduce the budget. And the problem we have in some ways is that the state legislature does not want to raise taxes. But if you don't raise taxes, then you don't have enough money to fund everything you want to do. So basically they just say, well, we don't have the money, so guess that's not getting funded. Rather than saying, how about a 2% increase in taxes on businesses? That's not going to happen. And part of that is you don't want to be seen as unfriendly to business, but honestly, we could probably charge them a little bit more and still be like the #1 state for business. But they want businesses relocating to Texas because it's a low cost of doing business. So, trade-off. I'm trying to remember where they're putting the new Tesla factory. I think it's near Austin, if I remember correctly. Yeah, aren't they fun? You look at your. Mm-hmm.
I would be earning $2,000 every 2 weeks. Is that about $700 or $800 every 2 weeks with taxes?
And that's the problem. You are paying the majority of the taxes rather than the business owners. And, okay, yes, I'm getting on my radical leftist platform here as I say this, but damn it, we should not be the ones paying the majority of the taxes. Because, I mean, you're working, you're going to school, you're trying to save for your future. You should not be paying the majority of the taxes. That should be someone making $200,000, $300,000 a year instead. Yeah, you work ridiculously hard for your money. You should be able to keep more of it. And just, no, I'm with you. That's ridiculous. That's just ridiculous. Oh man, yeah, I don't. You guys should get hazard pay, but that's what I think. It's probably why I'm not in charge of the state. Okay, budgets. Here in Texas, the state legislature and our executive branch create separate budgets. It's not uncommon on the federal level. Sometimes the president will put forth his version of the budget and then Congress will put together theirs. So the legislature gets help with the budget from the Legislative Budget Board, which is the 4 representatives, 4 senators, lieutenant governor, and speaker of the House. The governor gets help from the Budget, Planning, and Policy Division. So what this means is that the governor does get a say in what's in the state budget. So the legislature has to be willing to work with the governor. So in 2003, the governor was treated as an equal participant in the budget process, which made the process very smooth. However, if the governor proposes one budget and the legislature another, and they are radically different, it's going to be very difficult to reconcile the 2 budgets. So it's relatively easy right now for Governor Abbott because Republicans control the majority of the state legislature. If that changes, it may be a more contentious process. But no matter how you create the budget, both budgets are going to have increases or decreases, the creation of new programs, and the priorities for the different state agencies and actors. There will likely be some commonality. Maybe the governor says we need to create a new program for pre-K education, and the state legislature also has that in their budget, then that's easier to iron out the differences. Okay, so because the state legislature only meets in odd-numbered years, they're going to start preparing the budget in the spring of the even-numbered years. You only have 140 days to pass a budget. That's not enough time to create a budget from scratch. So they start putting together the budget in the spring of even-numbered years. This year, that was probably done virtually for the most part, but they were talking about what was going to be in the budget. So then they put together kind of a version of the budget. And then there's hearings in the fall of the even-numbered years. So there's joint hearings that are held by the governors and legislative budget board staff members. And you'll see the agencies providing information. Here's how much Homeland Security needs, or education, or healthcare. And lobbyists aren't quiet during this time. They're going to be showing up and trying to provide information and add their opinions on the budget. So lobbying is pretty much year-round in Texas. In the off year, it's lobbying the people who create the budget. During the legislative session, it's lobbying the people who will eventually pass the budget. And the budgets are very large. You have to have an agency by agency breakdown in the specific budget categories. So you've got to break down the needs in terms of healthcare through things like infectious disease control, public health care, Medicare, Medicaid, and so on. And then they send the budget to the committees, and here's where we really see the problem with our state system. They have to try to project state spending for almost 3 years, which means they cannot respond to economic challenges or crises, which means we are setting up a budget in 2019 for a robust economy with no ability to fix for the fact that we're in the middle of a freaking pandemic. So a little bit problematic on that you're trying to predict an economy for 3 years when it's next to impossible to predict what's going to happen the next year, let alone the next 3. Okay, so you've got the committees putting together the budget, and then you also have the committees that are working on the authorization and appropriation. A lot of what our state legislature does mimics the federal Congress. So we have a state House Ways and Means Committee, a state House Appropriations Committee, and a state Senate Finance Committee. These committees exist on the federal level as well. So most states have created their state legislature to mimic the federal and keeping some of the committees that would be in charge of budgets. There's less people on these committees in Texas, of course, compared to the federal level, but they're still the ones largely in charge of creating the budget. And then, of course, you've got interest groups coming in and trying to influence the budget. Look at agencies, interest groups, and citizens testifying before the committees. And then in the state legislature itself, you'll find coalitions, bargaining, compromise, and vote trading. And interest groups really can have an influence on politicians. Politicians like to be seen as tough on crime. No one wants to be accused of being soft towards criminals. So you get interest groups coming in and going, we need more prison guards, we need more funding for the criminal system. And so what happens? A little bit more money goes into criminal justice rather than education. And when they're getting close to election year, if someone's up for re-election, they're definitely not voting against a crime bill. That's pretty much a kiss of death for their career. True. Yeah. Right. White-collar criminals, people who have committed mass murder, yeah, you want more safety there. And we do tend to see things like business lobbying coming in. Business agreed to take new taxes in 2006 in exchange for basically less regulation. We'll pay a little bit more in taxes if you promise to back off of us a little bit. And now they have more protections from lawsuits. It's now harder to sue a business or a doctor for malpractice. And if you do sue, you don't get as much money compared to other states. Teachers have been able to get a little bit of a raise. Last year, a whole bunch of school teachers went up to Austin and protested outside the legislative session and forced them to pass a pay raise and increase the state's contributions to the teachers' retirement system. So sometimes teachers can get organized enough and present a big enough threat that they get what they want, but they're just not necessarily as influential. But if teachers go on strike, you better bet people are going to be going, hey guys, get to the table and sort out what they want. Okay. So then the committees report on the status of the budgets near the end of this pre-legislative session. And then you have to figure out how to develop a single budget report because they're never identical in form. So you're going to have 5 representatives and 5 senators creating a single budget report that takes into consideration what the governor wants and what the legislature wants. So they have to figure out how we're going to fund the agencies and proposals. So when the legislature is in session, they've got these budget reports submitted to them, and they have to combine it into one single state budget. And then they send it back to both chambers. And at this point, no changes can be made to the budget. So either they accept the budget as it stands or they reject it. It's all or nothing at this point. Someone can't add a last-minute amendment authorizing $2 million for computers in the classroom. They're pretty strict about what they call a Christmas tree amendment, where you're basically hanging ornaments on the budget. Can't do it after this point. So the approval of the budget is usually done towards the end of the session. And in 2011, they couldn't get it done before the end of the regular session, so they had to hold a special session right after to get the budget. If you don't approve the budget during the regular session, you're going to have to stay a little longer. There's no budget, no government. And God knows what happens if our state government collapses. It ain't going to be pretty. So all of the horse trading, all of the voting, all of the negotiating is done. It's a straight up or down vote. It's either approved or it's not. Usually, of course, it is approved. Legislators don't want to stay longer than they have to in Austin. It's not exactly cheap to live there. So then they send it to the governor, and the governor can use the line item veto. He can choose to remove funding for a subsection of the education budget. But he or she cannot add to the budget or restore funding for projects that the state legislature refused to fund. The governor can't say, I'm accepting this budget, but I'm adding $2 million that you guys rejected. He cannot add to the budget. he or she has to accept it as is. Can choose to veto certain items, but can't make major changes to the budget. And the line item veto is important because you don't want the governor vetoing the entire budget. So he can go through and he can strike out a couple of things, but he's going to pretty much sign the budget at that point. Okay, those of you online, do you have any questions at this point? All right, so now, of course, you have to execute the budget. So in 1987, the governor was given the power to slow down expenditures. But every time the governor tries to increase his or her powers, the voters strike it down. It would take a constitutional amendment to give the governor more power, and the voters refuse to do it. Every time he or she tries, the voters strike it down. In 1991, they finally agreed that the Legislative Budget Board can move money between agencies as needed. So if one agency isn't spending all of their money and another one is running low on money, they can basically take the money from one and give it to the other. And this is where they finally allowed the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker to deal with spending. So this is when we saw the governor really getting involved in the budget process, having a voice in terms of where the money is being spent. And then, of course, you've got the ability to audit an agency. The state auditor can send a letter, usually an email today, saying, look, we don't like what we're seeing here. We're going to look into your budget. We're going to look and see where you're spending the money. We're getting complaints about management. Maybe we need to fix that. Maybe instead of calling people customers, you call them consumers. Telling them that they have to make changes like maybe not biting the heads off of the people who are applying for a driver's license. Okay, everybody breathe a sigh of relief because now we're done talking about the budget. Now we get to talk about spending. Yay! Slightly less. Yeah, now we get to figure out where our money is going. One of the biggest expenditures, of course, is education. I mean, this is such a big state that there are a lot of education costs. So about $74.2 billion gets spent on education, which is actually only about 38% of the budget. So it doesn't make up the majority of the budget. Makes up a significant chunk, but not the majority. And there are about 1,081 school districts that do need funding, in addition to state schools for deaf and blind students. So about 83% of that $74 billion is going into elementary and secondary schools, so K through 12, essentially. So the state has to fund the cost of textbooks, and this is only in public schools, by the way. Private schools, completely different. So they have to fund textbooks for public schools, services for disabled children, including things like special education classrooms, and so on. They fund the state achievement test that I know you guys just absolutely loved in high school, the school buses, the operating costs, and the teacher salaries. We don't tend to realize how much money has to go into making schools run. There's a lot of things people don't necessarily consider when they're looking at how much money goes into education. Now, part of the cost is shared by the local school districts. The cities essentially control the school buildings, how many schools there are, if you build a new school, and so on. So, of course, the wealthier school districts can pay a higher teacher salary, which means they get some of the best teachers in the state. They get newer editions of textbooks. There's more resources in the libraries, and there's more extracurriculars and student athletic opportunities. If you go to a wealthy school district and your football team is actually pretty good, you're probably going to get a scholarship to play somewhere, maybe UT, maybe outside of Texas. So part of the problem with education spending is that a lot of it is based on where you live. You live in a wealthy suburb of Houston, your school district's going to be pretty good. You live down here, there's only so much money to go around. They do the best they can, but there's only so much that can be done. So we rank 36 in terms of per student education funding, which isn't great, but there are states that are worse than us. So we're somewhere towards the bottom, but not at the very bottom. All right, so a little under $18 billion gets spent on higher education. This includes the cost of operating colleges, universities, community colleges, technical colleges, health science programs, and retirement systems for teachers in higher education. So as a professor, I had two choices for a retirement account. I could go with the teacher's retirement system, which is the public one, or I could choose to do a private one where part of my money would go into the stock market. I chose the public option because I do not trust the stock market. So part of that is just helping when teachers eventually retire. So in 2003, the state legislature decided to deregulate college tuition, which is why colleges can charge different tuition rates. It's why you won't pay as much here compared to somewhere like UT, Baylor, Rice, and so on. And it's going to differ on a couple of things: private versus public, in-state versus out-of-state. All that's going to factor in. Housing, if you're living in a dorm, you're going to have to take out more student loans, things like that. College tuition is what mostly funds a college campus. So, unfortunately, what we tend to see is if a college is facing a budget shortage, they raise tuition, which is kind of a catch-22, because if you raise tuition, then maybe less people enroll, but then if you have less people, what do you do about tuition? It's kind of a vicious cycle. Nationally, we rank 30th in the number of people 25 and older with a bachelor's degree. Again, not great, but we're kind of towards the middle on that. So we're not terrible, but we could be doing a better job. Nationally, the average for students in public colleges and universities is 75%. In Texas, it's about 87.5% of students enroll in a public college or university. And this makes sense. The UT and A&M systems are huge, right? There's hundreds of University of Texas and Texas A&M campuses. So it's not that hard for people to stay relatively close to home and just go to a public school. There are, of course, private schools like Baylor and others, but there's so many public colleges that it makes sense that most students end up at a public school. Are either of you planning to transfer to UTRPB when you finish here? Okay. That's pretty common, because it's right down the road and it's easy enough to, yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. People tend to go close to home. You save more money if you're not living on campus, things like that. Yeah. I got lucky where I did my undergrad, Western Illinois University. At the time, they were one of 2 state schools to offer tuition guarantee. Whatever you paid your first year, you paid all the way through. Your tuition was locked in. So your tuition never went up, which was actually kind of nice, because then you could figure out exactly how much you needed to take out. So my tuition never went up. It was locked in my first year there. So that's actually kind of nice if they do that. Okay. There's also massive amounts of money that have to be spent on health and human services. So we've got $85 billion that's allocated for a hell of a lot of programs. Welfare, employment services like job training and job placement, the workers' compensation system, services to help the blind and the elderly, mental health programs, although sadly we're not as good on that as we should be, children's health insurance, substance abuse treatment, drugs, alcohol, etc., contagious disease control, usually for something like an outbreak of whooping cough. Of course, this year the focus is on COVID, and money to help fund treatments for HIV, AIDS, cancer, and kidney failure. Yeah, there's a lot in health and human services that we don't really realize is part of that overall healthcare spending. About 60% of our healthcare funding comes from the federal government. We have state Medicare and Medicaid offices, but they are federal programs. So the majority of that funding is going to come from the federal government. So the majority of the healthcare budget is not necessarily paid by us. I mean, technically, because we pay the federal government in taxes, but largely we're getting the money from the feds. We have the dubious distinction of ranking 41st for per capita funding on welfare, which means we are very, very stingy when it comes to welfare payments and benefits. We are 26th for hospital services. We're actually pretty decent on that. And there are some very good healthcare systems in Texas. UT hospitals are pretty damn good. We've got some cutting-edge research going on here in Texas. I had an aunt who had non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and she was being treated in Austin for the most part. And they were doing some experimental treatments with her that prolonged her life. It was terminal cancer, but she lived longer than she would have if she hadn't been able to take advantage of these treatments. So they're working on things like gene therapy, micro-targeting of cancer. So there's some pretty important research being done here in Texas. Unfortunately, what we tend to see happening is social services are the first to get cut during an economic crisis. Welfare spending goes down. Healthcare. The cost of healthcare rises during an economic crisis. Some people lose access to healthcare. Okay, so education and healthcare are two big expenditures, but there's also a handful of others. We spend about $38 billion on transportation, economic development, housing and community affairs, and employment/training services. About half of the funding for transportation comes from the federal government. Half of funding comes from the federal government, especially for transportation. The federal highway system is, of course, the responsibility of the federal government. So we get matching funds from the federal government to maintain or upgrade the 3,233 miles of federal interstate highways in Texas. We have some of the biggest and longest stretches of federal highway of any state. So we do get a fair amount of money to maintain the interstate, which is why you've probably seen in and around Edinburgh and McAllen, they're constantly doing construction, trying to create overpasses, expand it to like 4-lane roads, things like that. Some of that's from the federal government. Our local roads, well, we're just kind of screwed on that. There's about 15, okay, well, actually going back to transportation. Part of the problem we have is that the state decided to cap our state highway expenditures in 1977. So we rank 45th in the nation in per capita spending on highways. So that's partly why our roads are so bad. why there's so many problems with potholes, 2-lane roads when it really should be at least 4, congestion around the exit towards Edinburgh or far right, which is a freaking nightmare, because we won't spend money on transportation. About $15 billion goes into law enforcement or public safety. That's about 5.8% of the state budget on homeland security, immigration, public police forces, and so on. $9 billion gets spent on our state parks and funding agriculture, which is about 3.4% of the budget. And then $6.7 billion goes to the governor, legislature, and judiciary, which is about 2.3% of the budget. So these aren't huge amounts of money. Is that all law enforcement? The $15 billion, is that what you're asking? Johnny, is $15 billion? Yes, that is all on things like Border Patrol, Homeland Security, local, county, and state law enforcement. Yes, that's all on basically state law enforcement. Border Patrol is also funded by the federal government, so most of what we're seeing for law enforcement is police, corrections, and so on. Yeah, and of course, law enforcement makes money every time they pull you over for speeding, not wearing a seatbelt, things like that. That's, yeah. That's where part of our money goes to if we get pulled over.
Federal officers, oh, these people were very they were supposed to do something like 50 miles speeding limits. And after stopped me, but when he sees my uniform, he just gives me a warning.
That sounds about right.
Because they give us a ticket, it just isn't their money.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I feel like here with the speeds and stuff, it's like unless you're going like 100 miles an hour, they're not pulling you over on the interstate. Like, I mean, I've seen people going like 90 and there's never a cop around, and you're just like, yeah, okay, whatever. Oh, come on, where was this? Oh, well, okay, yeah, inside the cities, yeah, they're a little crazy, but out on the open road, I don't think they're quite as crazy. Yeah, I've just great story about my grandmother. She was late for work, and so she comes down the hill from where they were living, kind of in the middle of nowhere in Iowa, heading towards Des Moines. And she came down the hill and she was doing 90 miles an hour, which she didn't realize. So a cop pulls her over and he's like, "You know how fast you were going?" And she's like, "Yeah, you might as well go ahead and shoot me now, because if I get a speeding ticket, my husband will kill me." And the cop's just like, "Slow down, okay?" And she's like, "Yeah, I'll slow down." He probably upset my grandmother's all of like 5'2" and doesn't look like a threat to anyone, but yes, yeah, she basically was just like, yeah. She didn't realize she'd gotten, yeah, she gets bummed that he'll go 90, and I'm just like, oh God, don't do that, but yeah. Okay, so you guys got through the budget process, hallelujah. Next week we are going to talk about social programs, welfare, healthcare, and so on. I know next Wednesday is the day before Thanksgiving. If you need to miss class because you're meeting up with family or something, that's fine. I don't personally like the fact that we have class the day before Thanksgiving, but we do. So if you need to miss class because you got to go out of town or you got to take care of your kids or whatever, that's fine. It's not a problem. So we'll have class next Wednesday, but if you have to miss, it's not a problem. And I should have your papers graded for you by the end of the weekend, so you guys can stop worrying about that. Not that you are, but if you're like me as a student, you're probably like, "Where's my grade?" I'm working on it, I promise. Okay, so that's it for